The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
There are artists who chase fame, and there are artists who run from it. Benny Andersson has always been the latter. For nearly 5 decades, the world has sung his melodies, danced to his chord progressions, and wept to the emotional architecture he quietly assembled behind the scenes of one of the greatest pop groups in human history. Yet Benny himself remained an enigma, a man standing just slightly off-center in every photograph, a genius whose fingerprints were on everything but whose face adorned nothing. Now, at 78 years old, Benny Andersson is finally speaking with a candor and depth that fans have never heard before. And what he's confirming changes everything. This isn't a story about scandal. It isn't about feuds or tabloid headlines or who said what backstage in 1977. This is something far more profound. This is the story of a man who poured his entire emotional life into music because he didn't know how else to survive, who built one of the most beloved catalogs in pop history out of private pain, who stood inside a phenomenon so enormous it nearly swallowed him whole, and who has only now, in the quiet of his late 70s, found the language to describe what that was actually like. What Benny Andersson has confirmed is something many listeners always sensed but could never quite articulate. That beneath the glittering disco-pop surface of ABBA's music, there was something ancient and melancholic at work. That the songs which made people feel so profoundly understood were themselves born from a profound need to be understood. That joy and grief were never opposites in the world of ABBA, they were the same instrument, played simultaneously. And that the man at the piano knew this all along. To understand Benny Andersson at 78, you have to understand Benny Andersson at 8. He was born in Stockholm in 1946, into a working-class family where music wasn't a career ambition, it was just part of the air. His father and grandfather both played accordion, and from the earliest age, Benny absorbed music the way other children absorb language. It wasn't something he studied, it was something he already knew. What made Benny different from most musically gifted children wasn't just his technical ability. It was his sensitivity to emotional subtext in sound. In interviews given over the years, Benny has described how even as a very young boy, he was drawn not to the flashiest melodies but to the spaces between notes, the tension before a chord resolved, the particular shade of melancholy that a major key could carry when it shifted unexpectedly. Swedish folk music, the music he grew up hearing at family gatherings and community celebrations, is filled with exactly that quality, a bittersweet undercurrent running beneath joyful surfaces. Benny absorbed it so deeply it became his musical DNA. By his teenage years, he was playing in local bands across Stockholm, developing a reputation as someone who could make a crowd feel something without being able to fully explain what that something was. When he joined the Hep Stars in the mid-1960s, the band that would make him a household name in Sweden long before ABBA existed, he was already writing songs that had a quality journalists struggled to name. They were catchy, yes. They were commercial. But they also had a weight to them, an emotional density that lingered after the melody faded. What Benny has confirmed in recent conversations is that this wasn't accidental or intuitive in the naive sense. He was conscious, even as a young man, of using music to process interior experiences he didn't know how to express otherwise. He grew up in a culture and generation that valued stoicism, that regarded emotional openness as something close to weakness. Music was the one socially acceptable place where feeling too much was not just allowed, but celebrated. For Benny, the piano wasn't an instrument so much as a pressure valve. This foundational understanding, that music was his primary emotional language, the place where he was most honest and most himself, explains everything that came later. It explains both the extraordinary beauty of what he created and the particular costs that beauty carried. When Benny met Björn Ulvaeus in the late 1960s, something clicked that neither of them fully understood at the time. They were performing as part of a touring show, their respective bands sharing a bill, when the two began writing together almost by accident. What emerged almost immediately was one of the great songwriting partnerships in pop music history, and what made it work was precisely that the two men were complementary rather than similar. Björn was a storyteller. He had an instinct for narrative, for character, for the kind of lyric that placed a listener inside a specific emotional moment. He was also more outwardly expressive, more comfortable with the public dimensions of fame, more naturally suited to the front-facing aspects of being in a globally recognized group. Benny was the architect of feeling. He thought in chords and colors, in harmonic tension and release. Where Björn gave ABBA's songs their stories, Benny gave them their emotional weather. In various interviews conducted over the decades, with Swedish radio, with documentarians, and most recently with journalists revisiting ABBA's legacy in the context of their remarkable 2021 comeback album Voyage, Benny has described the writing process with Bjorn as something close to a conversation in two different languages that somehow always arrived at the same meaning. Bjorn would bring words or concepts, Benny would sit at the piano and find the harmonic landscape those words lived in. Sometimes it worked immediately. Sometimes they would spend days circling a single unresolved chord, knowing the feeling they were after, but not yet sure how to capture it. What Benny has confirmed with increasing openness as he's grown older is that many of the harmonic choices that give ABBA's most beloved songs their particular emotional texture were direct translations of his own psychological state. The way Fernando carries both celebration and sorrow simultaneously. The way The Winner Takes It All sounds like grief dressed in the clothes of dignity. The way even Dancing Queen, ostensibly one of the most purely joyful pop songs ever written, has a chord change in its bridge that arrives like a small, quiet ache. These weren't accidents of inspiration. They were deliberate emotional decisions made by a man who was always writing about something more personal than the lyrics alone suggested. This is what Benny has confirmed at 78 that we could only sense before. His music was never purely pop. It was always autobiography, just translated into a language that didn't require him to use his own name. Annie Fridlingstad, known universally as Frida, and Benny Andersson were partners for many years, first romantically, and then as husband and wife from 1978 until their divorce in 1981. Their relationship ran parallel to ABBA's greatest period of creative output, and it is impossible to separate the emotional landscape of the music they made together from the emotional landscape of what was happening between them privately. Frida's life story is one of extraordinary resilience. Born in Norway in 1945 to a Norwegian mother and a German father, a fact that made her childhood deeply complicated in the post-war years, she already survived abandonment, poverty, and profound personal loss before she ever stepped into a recording studio. When she found her way into music, and eventually into Benny's orbit, she brought with her an emotional intensity and an openness that was the opposite of everything Benny's upbringing had conditioned him to be. Benny has spoken, in interviews with Swedish publications over the past several years, with genuine tenderness and genuine regret about what their relationship was and wasn't. He's described Frida as someone who felt things openly and needed the people she loved to meet her in that openness. And he's described himself with characteristic honesty as someone who found that kind of direct emotional exchange almost impossible. Not because he didn't feel, but because feeling for Benny had always happened at the piano. In real life, in real time, with another person looking at him and needing something from him, he often simply couldn't find the words or gestures that the moment required. What Benny has now confirmed is that this wasn't a failure of love. It was a failure of emotional translation. He loved Frida. He also had, by his own account, no reliable way to show her that love except through the music he was constantly creating. The tragedy, and Benny uses that word himself, is that the music was always slightly delayed. It processed feelings that were already in the past. By the time a song existed that expressed what he had been feeling 6 months earlier, the moment that song was responding to had long since come and gone. He has described keeping the feelings alive in music as a kind of emotional hoarding. Nothing was lost. It was all there in the recordings, in the chord progressions, in the specific minor to major resolutions that appear throughout ABBA's catalog like emotional punctuation. But Frida couldn't hear it the way he needed her to hear it. And he couldn't say it any other way. This gap, quiet and seemingly unbridgeable, was at the heart of their eventual separation. Benny has said that listening back to the music from that period, particularly the albums Voulez-Vous and Super Trooper, which were recorded during the unraveling of both ABBA's marriages, is like reading a diary he wrote in code. He knows what every musical decision meant. He knows what he was trying to say. And he spent the years since wishing he'd found a way to say it more directly to the person who needed to hear it in real time. There is a particular kind of invisibility that comes with being indispensable but unrecognized, and Benny Andersson has lived inside it for most of his professional life. From the earliest days of ABBA's international breakthrough, which came with their victory at the Eurovision Song Contest in Brighton in 1974, the public narrative of the group was built almost entirely around its two female singers. Agnetha Björk and Frida were the faces, the fashion icons, the emotional representatives of the ABBA brand. Benny and Bjorn were, in the press and in popular imagination, the men behind the music, a phrase that sounds respectful but functioned as a way of pushing them to the margins of their own creation. Benny has been candid in recent years about how this affected him, particularly in the early stages of ABBA's fame. He wasn't, by his own account, someone who craved the spotlight in the way that fame requires. He didn't want his face on posters or his personal life dissected in magazines. But there is a difference between not wanting celebrity and not wanting recognition, and Benny wanted the latter desperately. He wanted people to understand what he was doing in those arrangements, what the harmonic choices meant, why he had made this particular string sound descend when the lyric was ascending, what it meant that the piano entered one beat later than you expected. Instead, critics wrote about ABBA as a pop machine, a commercial phenomenon, a triumph of packaging over substance. And while the sales figures were undeniable and the emotional impact on audiences worldwide was clearly real, the analytical recognition of Benny's craft as something sophisticated and deliberate was largely absent. He was seen as a pop craftsman rather than a serious composer. The distinction mattered deeply to him. What Benny has confirmed at 78 is that this critical dismissal left a mark that took decades to fully reckon with. He has spoken to Swedish journalists about how he would read reviews genuinely hoping, that someone would notice the unconventional chord structure in a particular bridge, or the way he had used silence as a rhythmic element in a specific arrangement. Occasionally someone did. More often they didn't. The songs were praised for being catchy. The architecture that made them catchy was invisible. This invisibility had a cumulative effect. It reinforced his tendency to retreat further into the music itself, to find his sense of worth not in external validation, but in the private knowledge of what he had actually built. This is an admirable response, and it produced extraordinary music. But Benny now acknowledges that it also deepened his isolation, both within ABBA and within himself. The man who knew best what ABBA really was, musically, emotionally, architecturally, was also the man least able to communicate that knowledge to the world that was consuming it. By the early 1980s, ABBA was in decline, not commercially at first, but existentially. The two marriages at the center of the group had both ended. Agnetha and Bjorn divorced in 1979. Benny and Frida followed in 1981. Both couples continued working together professionally after separating personally, which is a feat that requires an almost superhuman degree of emotional compartmentalization. For a while it worked. Super Trooper, released in 1980, was one of ABBA's biggest commercial successes. But the emotional cost of those recordings is audible to anyone listening closely. Benny has described the recording sessions from that period as unlike anything else in his professional experience, not because they were chaotic or hostile, but because they were suffused with a sadness that everyone was trying to work around rather than through. The music they were making was, in several cases, directly about the pain of the relationships that were ending. The Winner Takes It All, one of ABBA's most acclaimed songs, was written by Bjorn but recorded with Agnetha, his ex-wife, singing lead. The emotional weight in that recording is not manufactured, is real, and everyone in the studio knew it. Benny has confirmed that by the time ABBA effectively ceased functioning as a group in 1982, he was running on a combination of professional obligation and creative exhaustion. The passion that had driven him through the 1970s, the genuine excitement of discovering what this particular group of four people could make together, had not disappeared, but had been buried under layers of unprocessed grief and accumulated strain. He kept working because that was what he did, because music was the only place he knew how to be fully himself, and because stopping would have meant sitting still with feelings he wasn't ready to face. The end came without ceremony, which is perhaps the most revealing detail. There was no final recording session acknowledged as the last. There was no farewell tour, no formal announcement, no collective moment of closure. Things simply wound down gradually, and then completely. Benny has said that the absence of a real ending was, in hindsight, characteristic of how ABBA had always operated emotionally, by avoiding the confrontation, by letting things dissolve rather than resolving them, by letting the music do the talking until there was no more music left. What happened to Benny Andersson after ABBA is one of the least told stories in pop music, and it is in many ways the most interesting chapter of his life. He didn't retire. He didn't spiral into the kinds of public difficulties that have claimed other artists after the end of peak fame. He did something quieter and in some ways braver. He went back to work, on his own terms, making the music he had always wanted to make when ABBA's commercial requirements didn't allow it. The musical Chess, which Benny created with Bjorn and lyricist Tim Rice in 1984, was his first major post-ABBA project, and it announced clearly that Benny's ambitions were larger than the pop format had permitted. The score is genuinely complex, harmonically sophisticated, emotionally layered, willing to sit in discomfort rather than resolve into easy uplift. It was not the massive global success ABBA had been, and Benny has said that this didn't particularly trouble him. He was making something that felt true, and the relative scale of its reception was secondary to that. Through the late 1980s and 1990s, Benny continued composing for theater and for his own band, Benny Andersson's Orchestra, which performs a repertoire rooted in Swedish folk and traditional music, the exact music that first shaped him as a boy. In interview after interview from this period, he describes the return to those roots as something close to coming home. Not nostalgically, but honestly. He had spent 15 years making music for the world. Now he was making music for himself, and finding that the two were not as incompatible as the commercial music industry had implied. What Benny has confirmed in his most recent reflections is that this period was also when he began, slowly and with considerable difficulty, to do some of the emotional work he had deferred for decades. He has spoken about therapy, about conversations with old friends and collaborators that he had avoided for years, about the particular quality of reckoning that arrives in middle age when the noise of professional life quiets enough to hear what you've been drowning out. He learned during these years that the same emotional avoidance that had allowed him to be so productive had also prevented him from being fully present in his own life. That the music, for all its beauty, had been partly a method of not dealing with things that needed to be dealt with. This is not a confession of regret so much as an acknowledgement of complexity. Benny does not wish he had been a different kind of artist. He is too honest about his own nature for that. But he does now see, with the clarity that comes with age and distance, that the music was doing work that life also needed to do, and that life suffered for it. In 2021, ABBA released Voyage, their first album of new material in 40 years, and the critical and commercial response was extraordinary. The album debuted at #1 in multiple countries. More significantly for Benny, it was received not as nostalgia, but as genuine artistic work. Critics who had dismissed ABBA in 1970s as pop fluff heard something different this time. They heard craft. They heard emotional intelligence. They heard, finally, what Benny had always been putting into the music. Benny has spoken about this reception with a modesty that feels entirely genuine. He didn't make Voyage to receive belated validation. He made it because the four members of ABBA had unfinished business with each other, because the story they had been telling together still had something left to say, because the emotional honesty that had always underpinned their best work was still available to them, enriched now by